The world was ending, and all anyone could do was watch. Earth, once teeming with life and promise, had become a battleground, a scorched landscape marred by the relentless march of an ancient and malevolent force. The sky was choked with smoke, the air thick with despair. Burning skyscrapers reached for the heavens like skeletal fingers, their flames a desperate cry for help. Humanity was at the brink, and the Malakar, alien demonic invaders, showed no signs of stopping. The alien ships hovered above the cities, dark and ominous, their strange, angular shapes casting shadows over the ruins below. They were monstrous things, organic, almost alive, and completely indifferent to the cries of those on the ground. For weeks, Earth's leaders had tried to reason with them. Messages had been sent across the stars, desperate pleas for peace, or at least understanding. But there was no reply, no negotiation, only silence, followed by unrelenting destruction. In the midst of it all, humanity's armies stood as a last line of defense, but they were being overrun, pushed back to the edges of their cities, and to the ends of their hope. General Riley, the leader of Earth's remaining forces, stood in the makeshift command center, a hastily set up tent amidst rubble, and watched the battlefield reports streaming in. He knew they were losing. He could see it in the faces of his soldiers, in the frantic voices of his advisors. The Malakar were not a force they could fight with tanks, bullets, or strategy. They were darkness incarnate, and humanity's light was flickering. And then there was the Doomslayer. He stood alone on the outskirts of what was once his home, a small city that had already fallen to the invaders. His eyes, hidden behind the visor of his battered helmet, were fixed on the ruins. His armor, scratched and scarred from countless battles, was all that remained of his old life as a soldier. But it wasn't the battles that had scarred him the most. It was what he had lost. The family that had been taken from him. The life that had been torn apart by the Malakar's advance. He clenched his fists, feeling the rage simmer within him, a white-hot fury that had been his only companion since that day. The day the Malakar had come and taken everything from him. He had watched helplessly as his loved ones were slaughtered, as his home was torn apart by these monstrous invaders. And in that moment, something inside him had broken, something that could never be repaired. The Doomslayer turned away from the ruins, his mind made up. Diplomacy had failed, alliances had crumbled, and traditional warfare had proven useless. He was done standing on the sidelines, done watching as the Malakar spread their darkness across the planet. He had nothing left to lose, and that made him dangerous. He walked towards a small bunker hidden beneath the rubble, one of the few places still intact. Inside it was dark, lit only by the soft blue glow of old computer screens. Weapons lined the walls, a collection of humanity's most advanced technology, all meant for a war that they were now losing. The Doomslayer began gearing up, each piece of armor and each weapon a step closer to his decision. He wasn't going to fight defensively any longer. He was going to take the fight to the Malakar, to the heart of their darkness, alone. He strapped on his gauntlets, feeling the weight of his mission settle on his shoulders. His helmet came on last, the heads-up display flickering to life, showing him the map of the Malakar stronghold that had been identified, the center of their operations on Earth. It was a suicide mission. Everyone knew that, but the Doomslayer didn't care. He had already lost everything that mattered. With his gear in place, he left the bunker, his eyes fixed on the alien ships in the distance. The ground trembled beneath his feet, as another explosion ripped through what remained of the city, and for a moment, he paused. He could hear the distant cries of the few survivors, their voices filled with fear and pain, and that was enough to make his resolve even stronger. He was going to end this, or he was going to die trying. The Doomslayer's ship was a small, solitary craft hidden among the rubble, its sleek design meant for speed rather than combat. He climbed inside, the cockpit lighting up as the systems powered on. He punched in the coordinates. The destination clear, the Malakar stronghold. The ship lifted off, leaving behind the broken city, the broken world, and the shattered hope of its people. The Doomslayer was not leaving to save himself. He was leaving to bring the fight to those who had taken everything from him. The rage within him was all-consuming, a fire that would not be quenched until the Malakar were nothing but ash. As his ship shot up through the clouds and into the dark expanse of space, the Doomslayer allowed himself a single moment to remember. He thought of his family, their smiles, their laughter, the warmth of their presence. He let that memory fill him, let it mix with the rage, until there was nothing left but the determination to see this through, to make sure that no one else would suffer the way he had. He would bring the fight to the Malakar, and he would show them what it meant to face a human with nothing left to lose. His fingers tightened on the controls, his eyes fixed on the distant shape of the Malakar stronghold, a massive, dark fortress that loomed ahead, its silhouette cutting against the backdrop of space. It looked like a gateway to hell itself, and the Doomslayer was ready to walk through it. The ship moved silently through the darkness of space, the vast emptiness surrounding it a reflection of the Doomslayer's inner turmoil. The stars glittered cold, distant, and indifferent to the battles of humanity. Inside the cockpit, the Doomslayer's face was set in stone, his eyes focused ahead. His fingers gripped the controls with a steady calm, though beneath the surface, his blood boiled with anticipation. He was plunging deep into Malachar-controlled territory, a journey from which there would be no return if he failed. The solitude of the ship matched his mission, a lone human venturing into the enemy's heart. The weight of that solitude pressed down on him, a constant reminder of what he had lost and what lay ahead. There were no allies waiting for him, no backup to call upon. He had become humanity's last desperate hope, but he embraced that burden without fear. The hum of the ship's systems provided a steady rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat that filled the silence. The Doomslayer adjusted his course, his eyes catching sight of the distant shape of the Malachar fortress, still a dark silhouette against the starry backdrop, but growing closer with each passing moment. It loomed ahead like a gateway to some hellish dimension, and he felt the rage stir within him at the sight of it. The memories came unbidden, his family, his old life, the peaceful world that had been shattered. He could still see their faces, hear their laughter. These memories were a double-edged sword. They fueled his fury, giving him strength, but they also hurt, a deep ache that never seemed to fade. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting those memories settle, letting them mix with the burning anger that had driven him to this point. Suddenly, an alert blared through the cockpit, snapping him back to the present. He opened his eyes, his HUD displaying flashing red warnings. Malachar sentries had picked up his ship. He could see them now, dark shapes detaching from the massive fortress and speeding toward. Their ships were smaller, agile, and as alive as the Malachar themselves, their organic forms twisting and shifting in the void. The Doomslayer's jaw tightened. There would be no avoiding this fight. He reached for the ship's weapons controls, his fingers moving with practiced precision. He had fought them before, knew their tactics, their methods, and he knew how to kill them. The first Malachar ship came into range, its organic hull shifting as it prepared to fire. The Doomslayer acted before it could, his ship's cannons blazing to life, bright energy bolts tearing through the darkness. The Malachar ship exploded, fragments scattering across the void. The other sentries veered, moving in a coordinated attack pattern, trying to flank him. But the Doomslayer was ready. He twisted the controls, his ship spinning out of their line of fire, his weapons roaring. Another Malachar vessel burst apart, its fiery remains swallowed by the cold of space. The Doomslayer's eyes narrowed, his focus absolute. Every fiber of his being centered on the fight. There was no fear, no hesitation, only the need to destroy them, to push forward, no matter the cost. The fight was over quick. The Malachar ships reduced to nothing but debris. The Doomslayer took a deep breath, his grip loosening slightly on the controls as the threat diminished. His ship continued its course, the Malachar fortress now much closer, its details becoming clearer. The massive, fortress-like structure seemed almost to pulsate, a living entity built from darkness and malice. It was their stronghold, the heart of their operations on Earth, and he was going straight into its core. He guided the ship toward a docking point, hidden amidst the twisted spires of the fortress. The structure loomed overhead, blotting out the stars, and the Doomslayer felt a cold determination settle over. He had come this far, and there was no turning back. He was going into the depths of the Malachar's domain, into the very heart of their darkness, and he would either destroy them or be destroyed. The ship docked with a metallic clang, the landing gear connecting with the alien surface. The Doomslayer stood, his body tensed, his armor feeling like an extension of himself as he moved. He checked his weapons one last time, each piece of gear perfectly in place, every weapon loaded and ready. He could hear the distant thrum of the fortress, a low, ominous hum that seemed to echo in his bones. He stepped out of the ship, his boots hitting the cold, uneven surface of the docking bay. The air was heavy, the atmosphere almost oppressive, as though the fortress itself were aware of his presence. He scanned his surroundings. Jagged walls, strange alien symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. There was no welcoming committee, but he knew that wouldn't last long. The Malachar would know he was here. The battle was intense, the narrow corridor filled with the sounds of combat, the screams of the Malachar, the blasts of his weapon, the echoes of footsteps as more warriors joined the fight. The Doomslayer's rage guided him, his focus unbreakable. He fought with everything he had, his body and mind working as one, pushing forward step by step through the swarm of enemies. Finally, the last of the Malachar warriors fell, its body collapsing in a heap at his feet. The Doomslayer stood amidst the carnage, his breathing heavy, the rage still burning hot within him. He glanced around, his eyes scanning for any sign of more enemies, but the corridor had fallen silent, the only sound the distant hum of the fortress itself. He continued forward, deeper into the heart of the fortress. The walls seemed to close in on him, the air growing colder, the darkness thicker. There were no windows, no openings, only the narrow path ahead, winding deeper into the unknown. The Doomslayer knew he was getting close to something important. He could feel it, a presence, dark and powerful, pulling him forward. After what felt like hours of moving through the dark, twisting corridors, the Doomslayer found himself in a large chamber. The walls were adorned with alien symbols, glowing with a sickly green light. In the center of the room stood a group of humans, prisoners, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. They were chained, their bodies battered and bruised. The sight of them made the rage inside him flare, his vision narrowing as he took in the scene. He moved quickly, his eyes scanning the room for any guards. There were none, but he knew better than to think it would be that easy. He approached the prisoners, his presence causing them to shrink back in fear. He could see it in their eyes. They weren't sure if he was there to save them or kill them. To them, he must have looked like another monster, a creature born of the same darkness that had taken them. The Doomslayer knelt beside the nearest prisoner, a young woman with hollow eyes and a face etched with pain. He reached for the shackles that bound her, his gauntleted hands carefully breaking the locks. She looked up at him, her expression a mix of confusion and hope. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The Doomslayer didn't answer. He simply moved to the next prisoner, breaking their chains, setting them free. The group watched him, their expressions slowly shifting from fear to hope as they realized what he was doing. He could feel their eyes on him, feel the weight of their hope. It was a burden, but one he was willing to bear. Once the last of the prisoners was free, he stood, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Follow me," he said, his voice distorted by the helmet. They hesitated, glancing at one another before slowly rising to their feet. They were weak, their bodies frail from whatever horrors they had endured, but there was a glimmer of strength in their eyes, a determination to survive. The Doomslayer led them out of the chamber, his weapon at the ready, his senses alert for any sign of danger. He moved quickly, his steps confident, the prisoners following close behind. They moved through the winding corridors, the eerie glow of the alien symbols guiding their way. The Doomslayer could feel the fortress reacting to their presence, as if it were alive, shifting and twisting around them. As they moved deeper into the fortress, the Doomslayer found himself thinking about the prisoners, their fear, their hope. He had come here for vengeance, driven by rage, but now he realized that there was more at stake than just his own pain. These people, these survivors, they were what he was fighting for. They were the reason he had to keep going, to keep pushing forward, no matter the cost. They reached another large chamber, the doors sliding open to reveal a group of Malakar warriors, their eyes locking onto the Doomslayer and the prisoners behind him. The Doomslayer stepped forward, his weapon blazing to life, the rage surging through him once more. He would not stop, he would not fail. He would bring the Malakar to their knees, or die trying. The Doomslayer led the survivors onward, their steps hurried as they moved through the narrow, twisted corridors of the Malakar fortress. The air grew heavier the deeper they went, the oppressive darkness pressing down on them. The alien symbols etched into the walls seemed to pulse with malevolence, as if the fortress itself was watching, waiting for them to make a mistake. The Doomslayer's eyes were fixed ahead, his weapon at the ready. He could feel the tension in the air, a sense that something was about to happen. The survivors followed close behind, their faces pale, their bodies trembling, but their eyes held a flicker of hope. They had seen what he was capable of, and for the first time in a long time, they believed they might have a chance. Suddenly, a rumble echoed through the corridor, the walls vibrating as if the fortress itself had come alive. The Doomslayer stopped, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the surroundings. He knew what this meant. The Malakar were aware of their presence, and they were not going to let them go without a fight. The survivors gasped as the floor beneath them began to shift, the ground rippling like water, throwing them off balance. The Doomslayer held his ground, his feet planted firmly as he watched the walls change, shifting and twisting to form an opening ahead. Through it stepped a figure, a Malakar high priest, its form towering and cloaked in dark energy, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. The high priest looked at the Doomslayer, its voice echoing through the corridor. "Human," it hissed, its words dripping with contempt. "You dare defy the will of the Malakar? You are but a speck, a fleeting existence. You think you can stand against us?" The Doomslayer said nothing. He raised his weapon, the cold fury in his eyes his only answer. The high priest snarled, its hands raised as dark energy began to swirl around it, the air crackling with power. The Doomslayer charged, his feet pounding against the shifting floor, his weapon blazing to life. The battle began, the corridor erupting in chaos as the two forces clashed. The high priest was powerful, its dark energy forming shields, lashing out at the Doomslayer in a flurry of vicious attacks. But the Doomslayer was relentless, his every movement fueled by the rage that burned within. He dodged the high priest's attacks, his body moving with a precision that came from years of battle, his weapons striking with deadly accuracy. The survivors watched in awe, their eyes wide as they saw the Doomslayer fight. He was a force of nature, his rage turning him into something beyond human, something unstoppable. They had heard stories of the Doomslayer, of the man who had lost everything and had taken it upon himself to fight back. But seeing him now, they understood why the galaxy feared him. He was not just a soldier, he was something far more dangerous. The High Priest let out a roar, its dark energy lashing out, striking the Doomslayer and sending him crashing into the wall. The impact cracked the metal, the force enough to make even the Doomslayer falter. He grunted, pushing himself up, his armor damaged, blood trickling down his face. But he did not stop. He could not stop. He looked at the High Priest, his eyes filled with an unyielding fury. The High Priest sneered, its voice mocking. "You cannot win, human. You will fall, just as your world has fallen." The Doomslayer's response was swift. He lunged forward, his weapon blazing, the blasts tearing through the shields the High Priest had summoned. He moved like a man possessed, his every strike a testament to the pain and loss he had endured. The High Priest staggered, its dark energy faltering as the Doomslayer's attack pushed it back, step by step. The rage within the Doomslayer surged, a primal force that fueled his every movement, turning his anger into power. He roared, his weapon smashing through the High Priest's defenses, the final blow piercing through the alien's chest. The High Priest let out a shriek, its body convulsing as the dark energy dissipated, leaving behind nothing but a lifeless husk. The survivors stared, their breaths caught in their throats, as the Doomslayer stood victorious, his chest heaving, his body battered but unbroken. He turned to them, his eyes meeting theirs, and for a moment they saw something beyond the rage, a flicker of humanity, a reminder of why he fought. "Move," he said, his voice strained but commanding. The survivors nodded, their fear replaced by determination. They moved forward, following him as he led them deeper into the fortress, their hope renewed. As they continued on, the Doomslayer could feel the toll the battle had taken on. His armor was cracked, his body bruised, and every movement sent a jolt of pain through him. But he pushed it aside. There was no time for weakness. He had to keep moving, had to keep fighting. The Malachar were relentless, and they would not stop until they had crushed every last spark of resistance. The corridors opened up into a vast chamber, the ceiling high above, the walls covered in strange, glowing symbols. The air was thick with dark energy, the atmosphere heavy and oppressive. At the far end of the chamber stood a massive door, its surface carved with intricate designs, pulsating with an eerie light. The Doomslayer knew this was it, the entrance to the core of the fortress, where the Malachar overlord awaited. He turned to the survivors, his voice low. "Stay here, I'm going in alone." They looked at him, fear and gratitude in their eyes. One of them, a young man, stepped forward. "You can't do this alone," he said, his voice trembling. "Let us help." The Doomslayer shook his head. "This fight is mine. Stay here, survive." The young man hesitated, then nodded, stepping back. The Doomslayer turned to the door, his eyes narrowing as he approached. He could feel the darkness beyond it, the presence of the overlord, the source of the Malachar's power. He reached out, his hand pressing against the door, the symbols glowing brighter as it began to open. The door slowly swung open, revealing a massive, dark chamber beyond. The Doomslayer stepped inside, the door closing behind him, sealing him in. The chamber was vast, the walls lined with strange machinery, the air crackling with energy. At the far end stood the Malachar overlord, a towering figure, its body cloaked in dark power, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The overlord looked at the Doomslayer, its voice echoing through the chamber. "You dare enter my domain, human? You are brave, but foolish. You will die here, and your world will burn." The Doomslayer raised his weapon, his eyes locked on the overlord. "I'm not here to talk," he growled, his voice filled with determination. "I'm here to end you." The overlord let out a roar, the chamber shaking as dark energy surged around it. The Doomslayer charged, his weapon blazing, the final battle beginning. This was it, the turning point, the moment that would decide the fate of humanity. He knew he might not survive, but that didn't matter. He had come here to fight, to stand against the darkness, and he would not stop until either he or the Malachar overlord lay dead. The two forces clashed, the chamber erupting in chaos, the fate of humanity hanging in the balance. The chamber reverberated with the force of the clash between the Doomslayer and the Malachar overlord. Energy crackled through the air, dark and menacing, as the overlord unleashed wave after wave of powerful attacks. The Doomslayer charged forward, his eyes narrowed, every muscle in his body coiled with determination. This was the end, the confrontation that would decide the fate of humanity. The overlord towered above him, its dark form shrouded in swirling shadows, its eyes glowing with malevolent light. It roared, its voice shaking the chamber, echoing off the walls like thunder. The Doomslayer did not flinch, he did not hesitate. He had fought through too much, lost too much to be stopped now. The Doomslayer fired his weapon, the energy blasts cutting through the darkness, striking the Overlord's shields. The Overlord retaliated, dark energy lashing out, tearing through the chamber, shattering the alien machinery that lined the walls. The Doomslayer dodged, his body moving with a speed and agility that belied his exhaustion, his armor clanking as he rolled to avoid the blasts. Each blow the Doomslayer landed brought him closer, each step pushing him towards his target. He could feel the weight of his mission, the hopes of those he had saved, and the memories of those he had lost. The Overlord was powerful, but the Doomslayer was relentless. He was not just a soldier anymore. He was a symbol, a beacon of hope for a world that had forgotten what hope felt like. The Overlord raised its hands, dark tendrils of energy swirling, gathering power. The Doomslayer felt the temperature in the room drop, an icy cold that seeped into his bones. The Overlord's attack hit, the energy wrapping around him, crushing him with an unnatural force. He gritted his teeth, his vision blurring from the pressure. Pain surged through him, every nerve on fire. But the Doomslayer's mind focused on one thing: the faces of his family, the laughter that had once filled his home, the warmth that had been stolen from him. He roared, a primal sound that shook the room, his fury breaking through the Overlord's dark hole. He raised his weapon, firing point blank, the blast shattering the dark tendrils and sending the Overlord staggering back. The Doomslayer seized his opportunity. He charged, his movement swift and decisive, his weapon striking out. He could feel his body protesting, his muscles aching, his armor cracked and blood seeping from his wounds. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He leaped towards the Overlord, his blade drawn, and plunged it deep into the creature's chest. The Overlord let out a guttural scream, its dark energy erupting in all directions, the chamber shaking as the creature convulsed. The Doomslayer twisted the blade, his eyes locking onto the Overlord's. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The dark energy, the shaking chamber, the roaring of the Overlord. And then, with a final, desperate shriek, the Overlord collapsed, its form crumbling into nothingness, the shadows dissipating. The chamber fell silent, the oppressive darkness lifting, replaced by a heavy stillness. The Doomslayer stood there, his chest heaving, his body battered but victorious. He looked down at where the Overlord had fallen, his eyes narrowing. It was over. The Malachar had been defeated. Humanity had been given another chance. He turned, the door to the chamber sliding open, the surviving prisoners standing there, their eyes wide, their faces a mixture of awe and fear. They had seen what he had done, seen the monster he had become to fight their enemies. For a moment, no one spoke. The Doomslayer looked at them, the flicker of humanity returning to his eyes. "You're safe," he said, his voice low, strained. "It's over." The young man who had spoken to him earlier stepped forward, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You saved us." The Doomslayer nodded, his gaze shifting to the survivors, their faces filled with hope, a hope that had been rekindled by his actions. He knew that what he had done had cost him a part of himself. He had embraced the darkness, allowed the rage to consume him, to become the weapon humanity needed. But seeing their faces, seeing the light in their eyes, made it worth it. He led them out of the fortress, the path ahead clearer now that the Overlord had fallen. The fortress itself seemed to collapse inward, the dark energy that had held it together dissipating, leaving behind only the cold metal and ruins. The survivors followed, their steps hesitant, their eyes glancing around as if afraid the darkness might return. But the Doomslayer kept moving, his steps unwavering. They reached the docking bay, where the Doomslayer's ship waited. He ushered the survivors inside, helping them into the cramped seats, their faces weary but relieved. He took his place at the controls, his hands moving across the panel as the ship powered on. The engines hummed to life, the ship lifting off, leaving the collapsing fortress behind. The Doomslayer glanced at the survivors, their eyes closed, their bodies slumping as exhaustion finally overtook them. He turned his gaze back to the stars, his eyes narrowing. The battle was over, but the war was not. The Malachar were defeated, but there would be others, other threats, other enemies. He had become something more than a soldier. He had become the one thing the darkness feared. As the ship moved through the vast emptiness of space, the Doomslayer allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had fought for vengeance, driven by loss and fueled by rage. He had embraced the darkness, become the monster that could face the monsters that threatened humanity. But in doing so, he had also become a symbol of hope, of what humanity could be when pushed to the edge. He knew the line between savior and monster was thin, and he had walked that line, teetered on the brink of losing himself. But for the survivors, for the hope he saw in their eyes, it had been worth it. The Doomslayer closed his eyes, the memories of his family filling his mind, their faces a reminder of why he fought, of what he had sacrificed. The ship moved onward, away from the ruins of the Malachar fortress, towards whatever future awaited them. The Doomslayer knew there would always be darkness, always be threats that needed to be faced, and he would be there, standing against them, the last hope of humanity, the embodiment of their rage and their will to survive.